Palingenesis by Simon Hereward. Book 1. Progeny of Hate. Chapter 5. An Unexpected Summons. Gareth had another dream that night. He was in the hills on his way to riot. His brother Lucain was with him, a friendly arm around his shoulders. The fear increased in him for his brother to see his worthless friend. He must not see him, but the arm was too strong to resist. It steered him up the hill, compelled him. He twisted and fought to no avail. He could make out a large dying air tree on the rise. It was stripped of leaves. He knew he had to avoid going there at all costs. He became frantic and had to have cried out. Lucain released him suddenly and turned to face him.
"I have a gift for you, Gareth. Why are you afraid?"
He smiled. Gareth could not move with terror. His hands received the gift unresistingly. It was an asp, writhing and smooth. It twisted in his grip to sink its fangs into him. The shock of it woke him, sweating and afraid. The image is still vivid in his mind, the feeling of paralyzing terror potent and fresh. It was almost dawn, but unusually cold for a sun-tide morning. He got up and stood before the open window which overlooked one of the many inner courtyards. He clambered onto the wide sill and sat down, enjoying the cold stone against his back and bare legs. The stars faded rapidly under his mesmerized gaze, till only the brightest ones remained visible. In the north, the great blue-white North Star, the eye of the dragon, still lingered, though Lauren's eyes had disappeared behind the western battlements. He sat motionless, thinking of the unending struggle between the light and dark, Imran's perpetual pursuit of his rival, and for a moment considered the possibility of an inverted world, where darkness pursued light. Mayhap that was the case in Myril, who could tell? Certainly not the priests, or even the king, despite his great self-assurance. Fengor of Nuria, what proud eyes he had! How sure they were of the power he possessed, the purpose he pursued. And for his second son, the dreamer, how often they had burned with disapproval, yes, once even with horror and revulsion. Though such instances could be counted on the fingers of his one hand, they stood in glaring accusation against the absence of but one look of affection. But had he earned such a glance? He doubted that. He was so different from Lucain, so weak. He had transgressed so often, and with such regularity, that he now almost dreaded falling under the scrutiny of the king, as he had on that wicked 10th day, the first of his vivid dreams still potent and frightening in his mind. He had had but 7 cycles. Korad, his first tutor, shocked and dismayed, had dragged him to the priests. How they had badgered him, till he had been in tears, confessing to wrongs of which he had had no conception. Then his father had come, not to rescue him from the nightmare, but to give him that look of shocked repulsion, which now he could not erase from his memory. Under his forlorn gaze, the soft early glow of Imran's orb dyed the walls opposite a pale golden shade of the usual slate gray. He jumped down, chilled by the cold stone, and dressed hurriedly in the fine new trappings he still had to get used to. He felt the excitement of a new day of uncertainty and discovery beckoning. It lifted his spirits from the melancholy shadows of the dream world. He soon found that there were no new and exciting discoveries to be made that morning. Malvor had little time to see him, and seemed preoccupied and short-tempered. He had been forbidden to leave the vicinity of the barracks in case he was needed, and had taken the opportunity to familiarize himself with his new surroundings. It was disappointingly far from his secret entrance. If he were to make use of it again, it would be difficult to explain his presence in the northwestern wing, since he now bunked in the southeastern parts of the citadel. He wandered about under the curious and bemused stares of the guards till he wanted to shout at them. As a last resort, he made his way down to Hubin and the relative peace of the stores. The old man welcomed him with a good-natured cackle and put him to work immediately. The presentation was a mere 3 days away, and candidates would soon be arriving from all over Nuria. Each of these would need to be fitted out with the necessary clothing and gear. The store would be invaded by many strange pairs of eyes, and thus had to be spotless and in perfect order. Gareth was set to dusting and sweeping, till Hubin scoffed that he had turned him from a prince into a scullion. The boy looked up from his work in exasperation.
See, that's all it is. You cannot look past the prince thing, even if I ask you. Everyone is like that.
What do you expect? There aren't too many princes around. It is an honor.
Gareth looked down at the dust accumulated around his feet.
I suppose. Though people will never treat you how they really feel. I mean, how do you know whether they like you because you are the king's son, or whether they just like you?
Hubin softened a little.
Everyone has that problem. Take me. I am in such demand that I hardly know what to do.
He was smiling in his sly way.
Now, would that be because I can issue replacement clothing, or because of my legendary wit?
His laugh was long and loud, drawing a smile from the boy. To Gareth's relief, they took their midday meal in the store. Though the repast had been intended for the storeman alone, he had little appetite for it, being far more interested in the generous amount of ale that accompanied it. Gareth had no use for the latter, and contented himself with the abandoned food. Hubin's curiosity was aroused.
You don't like ale?
Gareth answered him between mouthfuls.
It makes me sick.
That bad, eh?
No, it makes me rich. I mean, oh, never mind.
The old man looked at him askance.
You simply haven't discovered the steady comfort of a good brew yet.
He drank deeply, smacking his lips and sighing in satisfaction after.
By the stone, sometimes I am sure it betters the comforts of a woman.
The meal had hardly been consumed when Hubin rose to return the plate and pitcher. Though he could have left it for the servant to collect later, it was clear that he needed to supplement the imbibed ale with an appropriate afterthought, or thus he explained it to the protesting Gareth, who was consequently left to his own thoughts in the store. It took but a moment for the curious boy to embark on a much-anticipated exploration of the place. Several doorways invited his hurried inspection, all but one locked and dusty with disuse. He pushed it open, his pulse quickening at the thought of arms or armor of great value. A soft pattering of feet greeted his entrance. He spotted several indignant rodent hindquarters disappearing into crevices, and smiled at the thought of breaking up their feast. For feasting they certainly had been, on scrolls and tomes and collections of old wall hangings, all stashed in disorderly piles in the light of a single low-burning lamp Hubin had to have placed there before the boy's arrival that morning. No doubt this also accounted for the unlocked door. He had probably surprised the old man at attempting to restore some order to this hidden mayhem. Since no shining blade or polished armor beckoned him inside, he had little inclination to spend his few stolen moments on old parchments. He was about to close the door in disappointment when the lamp winked slowly in a momentary brightening preceding extermination. Almost instinctively he stepped forward to adjust the wick, and his gaze fell on the partially unrolled and flattened parchment a careful hand had spread out next to the light. It was ancient and discolored, faded to such a degree that the elaborate text on its surface had been partially obscured and rendered unreadable in places. What would Hubin want with such old writings? A terrible curiosity gripped him. How old was the scroll? Could it precede the summoning? Hubin risked certain death if this was the case. He glanced about him as if scores of priests would materialize as soon as he read the first line of ancient script.
Song of the Dreamer.
Did it say dreamer or seeker? The meaning of the Viran word floated on the edges of his understanding. Its substance gleaned from the oldest of tales in the bookery, the ones in neglected corners you had to read in secret. Forgetting himself, Gareth read the next lines out loud.
Sung on the initiate's course, till purpose is discovered.
Several lines were lost or indecipherable. He peered closely at the script.
I hold the promise unfulfilled, until the cavern, hollow, of my heart sounds with purpose there instilled, by the calling of the art.
An eerie silence had descended on the room. Gareth glanced at the door, resisting the urge to close it. But how would he hear when Euban returned? Slowly, carefully, he touched the decaying words. Whispers, shivering echoes of primordial truth spilled from the page, to billow about him in an alluring yet fearsome fog. Something of the mirror pool, the broken stone outside the citadel, the temple in the bowels of Belruth, reached into him. A cold touch, irresistible, beautiful, made his skin crawl.
I hear no other voice. I heed no other force. I mind no other choice. I take no other course.
Could it be that these words were meant for him? Why was it that he was so sure that they had waited for him here? That they had somehow issued forth in response to his endless questions?
Till the stars share their secrets, and the pattern of my path is clear, till I have my guiding vision, I will walk the trails of Vir.
A sound reached his enchanted ears. He looked up in familiar fear. If he should be discovered now. There it was again, a foot on paved stone. He dared not steal another glance at the profane parchment as he sped out of the room. The door was safely shut, and the intruder vanished before he could be trapped. The only sign of disturbance was the faint set of footprints in the layered dust on the floor. Gareth tried to recapture some of the light-hearted mood of earlier before he stepped out among the shelves of the main storeroom. There was no sign of Euban, however, and he heaved a sigh of relief. A quick suggestion to return to his illicit reading was rejected almost immediately. He certainly did not possess the nerve to risk another incursion into that most dangerous of rooms. What possessed Euban even to keep such an incriminating parchment there? Certainly the mere reading would bring the penalty of death from the High Quester. Yet he knew the answer perfectly well. It was the same insane fascination that would not allow him rest till he had discovered what truth those old crows were hiding from him. He shuddered, making an effort to rid himself of the magic of the ancient words that still seemed to cling to him. When Euban returned, he would be found engrossed in ordinary objects. The tapestry behind Euban's table seemed safe enough. It was impressive, the golden beast of power, at once a symbol of Nuria's might and a ward against its enemies. Here it stretched in full measure on its crimson field, not merely a contracted emblem on the surcoat of a guard. The heavy brows frowned down on him, the nostrils flared in eager malevolence, a flicker, a trick of the eye, yet how the world below shimmered in the outbreath of searing heat. Gareth drew back, his mind already searching for a way of escape. Surely it was only the breath of wind stirring the huge canvas. Yes, the far-off breeze of a foreign field, lined with spears and bright armor. Above them, envenomed claws fought the currents, featherless wings were folded for the plunge, spewing hurt and death on the hosts below, the farms, the fleeing peasants. Belruth was sinking in a sea of flame. Pitiful, smoldering heaps were all that remained of her defenders. Cries, horrible voices of complete despair broke from the ruins. "The king! The king is slain!" A hand on his shoulder made Gareth give a violent start. It was a claw like the dragon war, but reaching into the sleeve of a familiar form.
Daydreaming?
Euban seemed unaffected by his excursion to the dining hall. There was no trace of a slur in his voice, nor any smell of wine on his breath.
You think the floors will sweep themselves?
Gareth forced a smile, his heartbeat still hammering in his throat. Only during the afternoon watch did Malvor summon him for an errand. He was briefly instructed to deliver a sealed letter into the hands of the master smith Triwan in person. The captain stressed this detail and then sent him on his way with a preoccupied scowl. Gareth ran all the way to Triwan's foundry. He did not mind running errands if it meant he could use the opportunity to sneak out to see Riot. The foundry was in the same quarter as the cottage of Riot's foster parents, and it would be a simple matter to visit there on his way back to the castle. The tall iron gate stood wide open, and his uniform gained him a speedy audience with Triwan, to whom he insisted on handing the message. The din of shaping metal between hammer and anvil was terrific. Most of the fine steel weapons and armor used in Nuria was fashioned here. Scores of artisans and their scurrying apprentices toiled in the heat, to transform different metals into helm, cuirass, sword, or even menial objects, such as plowshares. A large proportion of Nurian men-at-arms had already adopted the fine steel swords and armor as their preferred weapons of war, partly owing to the shortage of chrysolite weaponry, but mostly because the old arts of composition and consolidation had worn thin, and consequently lost popularity. Many now believed that metal blades were as fine as the old blades, though these opinions were seldom voiced and never tested, for wielders of the old blades had about them an aura of mastery and skill that awed possible contenders into grudging silence. Gareth made his way into the further reaches of the huge structure, where several sweaty men teamed up against the weight of the smelting cauldrons and molds. Truan, the master smith, was a formidable sight. He worked stripped to the waist in the heat of the foundry, his massive arms and torso glistening. He wore sturdy gloves and an apron of cowhide against the flying sparks and high temperatures. Although he was a commoner, he commanded the respect of all around him. He took the sealed letter from the boy, dismissed him with a nod, and turned his attention elsewhere. Gareth was grateful to get away so quickly. He would have time for a word with his friend. Brido and Guila stayed in the outer village, some 300 yards outside the south or King's Gate. No buildings could be erected closer than this to the fortress wall, since the structures would act as cover for besieging forces. Their home was a modest one, built of stone and rushes. Here they had welcomed the little boy, worthless or no, to brighten their childless existence. They were not Nurian, and therefore cared little for defects their adopted child would display. His slower mind and speech, and his lack of Nurian qualities, would not impair his ability to herd sheep or goats, which was what his vocation would be as the son of an aging shepherd. Riot's Nurian parents had been exceptionally kind to let him live, since most babies born thus were simply destroyed. Or maybe they had not been so kind, considering the miserable lives these children often led. Riot was no exception. He had found out early enough that he had no real parents, that he was worthless and inferior, even in the eyes of the lesser races in and around Belruth. The taunts and insults of other children, and some adults, had spelled out to him that he was cursed, the result of a forbidden union, and undesirable. Brido was powerless to prevent his isolation and misery, but he took comfort in the thought that shepherds were often loners, that had only their animals for company. The boy was good with animals, and took to them for companionship. Here was acceptance, and even affection, that did not set conditions. He was happy in the hills with his sheep, and apprehensive about returning to the village at night. Brido tried to take the boy with him when he went to the alehouse of an evening, or when he simply visited a friend. In this way he hoped to break through the growing isolation. It was a futile struggle, though, and as the boy grew older he seemed less and less inclined to mingle with other people. One of the few places into which the persistent Brido could still coax him was the oak, for the boy was passionately fond of music. The ancient oak owed its name to a giant oak tree that towered over the 2 stories of the inn. The perpetual shade caused by its mighty branches had allowed creepers to festoon the entire western wall of the inn, and even cover part of the roof. It caused the westernmost rooms to be somewhat dank and moldy throughout the cycle. This particular circumstance did not bother the keeper too much, since by far the greater part of his custom came from the casual visitors living in the proximity, who frequented the large common room on the ground floor. It was a popular haunt for the locals, a place where they could laugh, enjoy their ale and perhaps a light meal, and also swap yarns or rumors. Tonight there were also a number of folks from further afield staying at the inn, for they had brought their sons for the temple ceremony, and would be in Belruth for a few days. The noise had therefore increased substantially, and there seemed to be an air of excitement about the place. Gareth half suspected that Ride would be here, and stood hesitating on the opposite side of the wide cobbled street, the scalding words of Melvor still ringing in his ears. He could not afford being seen tramping over Belruth to seek out the shepherd trash with whom they would not have him associate. The customers of the oak had a reputation for their loose tongues besides. Melvor would hear of his defiance within a day. Was there a chance that Riot could be in the cottage with Guila? When would Brito make his way home? The orb was fast heading for the western horizon, and soon he would have to hurry back to supper in the barracks. He was about to turn away and walk up the street when a louder than usual burst of mirth from the inn caused him to turn back in curiosity. There was a scuffle just inside, and then the doors burst open. A small figure was flung bodily from the alehouse amidst roars of approval and laughter. He picked himself up and limped blindly in Gareth's direction. It was Riot. Gareth stepped up to him, and Riot drew back before he recognized who it was. He was unhurt, but his cheeks were stained with tears of anger and humiliation. The sight of Gareth seemed to bring him to his senses. He drew a dirty sleeve across his eyes and sniffed loudly.
You are a soldier.
His voice still carried traces of the anger he tried to control.
Yes, they forced me, Riot. But what has happened to you? Who were those men? Filthy swine. They laughed and said ugly things.
He spat on the ground.
What did they say about you?
Once again, Gareth felt a helpless anger rise. What good was it being a king's son when you could not even protect your friend?
Not about me. About you. They said...
His eyes grew large, and he bit his lip as if to prevent further speech.
About me? What could they have said about me? Tell me what happened. Who are they?
He was astonished. He took a step in the direction of the doorway, but Riot grabbed hold of his arm.
No, they are drunk. Men from store. They brought their sons for the temple thing. Brito is also in there.
Gareth was shocked.
He is in there, and he let them throw you out. He said I must apologize. And when I wouldn't, he let them take me. He said I was insolent. Yes. Why did you have to apologize? They said things.
His voice trailed off.
What things?
Riot did not reply. He was staring down at the cobbles, his lips tightly pressed together.
Why won't you tell me? I'll go and ask them myself. No, just lies.
Gareth decided to let it go at that. It was getting late, and he still had to explain his future absence from the pastures to Riot.
I'll have to hurry back for supper, or they will really be angry. They're watching me now, Riot. I cannot even get out to the hills anymore.
Riot's eyes were large and accusing.
You work all the time? No, not all the time. But they do not want me to go into the hills. I might get away from them on 10th days or festivals, but I can't be sure.
He looked at the other boy, suddenly uncertain, knowing that his situation would not be understood. Riot regarded him impassively at first, and then the realization slowly dawned on him that he was being abandoned. His eyes avoided Gareth's, and his expression turned dull and defensive. He resisted sullenly when he was half dragged out of sight of the street into the deep shadow behind the massive trunk of the oak. There he stood in pained silence. Gareth knew this mood all too well. He did not have the time for meticulous explanations and reassurances, and was not inclined to attempt them if he had. It was unfair that he had to cope with the hurt feelings of his friend because of a misunderstanding, and his own loss was ignored as always. Yet he had learned to disregard these rising urges to feel sorry for himself and concentrate on saving the situation.
Look, Riot, I'll tell you all about it when I see you again.
His eyes had adjusted sufficiently to make out the other boy's glum expression. It made him look younger than what he was.
I will find a way of getting out. It just won't be as easy and as often as in the past. Surely you understand that.
There was no reaction, no change. He took a step backwards till he could lean his back against the rough bark. The fading rays of daylight had already bathed the western sky in shades of rosy pink. He would have to run all the way back if he were to avoid the awkward questions. He faced his friend for one final attempt.
Riot, I will never desert you.
The head drooped even lower. He gripped him by the shoulders and forced him to look into his eyes.
I swear to you. I'll come and see you soon.
The voice was small and sulky.
When? This 10th day, or the next, for certain.
He squeezed the shoulders gently and then drew the sullen form into a quick embrace before speeding away into the dusk. It turned out far better than he had hoped. Supper was not a formal affair in the barracks, and there were no fixed places for non-ranking men or novices. His absence would therefore not be noticed unless someone was specifically looking for him. As yet, he knew no one in the common mess hall by name, and was sure that no one would be able to account for his presence or absence there. This would change with time, and as the number of his acquaintances grew. For the present, though, all he had to do was fetch a bowl and plate from the long tables lining the walls, and help himself to the ample supply of food. He had seated himself where he pleased and selected a ripe-looking peach from the bowl in front of him when he remembered his errand and the stern face of Melvor. He knew that the captain would have expected a report as soon as he returned. Supper would have to wait a little longer. Gesturing to the nearby scullion that he had not completed his untouched meal, he made his way among the rowdy tables and through the double door separating the mess halls. Melvor had finished his meal and was engaged in conversation over a goblet of wine with several of the other officers of Belruth. The men opened a pathway as Gareth approached, and their close scrutiny added to his discomfort. He halted some 5 yards away and waited for the captain to address him. Perchance it irritated him slightly to be disturbed by this unimportant matter, or he saw an opportunity to take his young charge in hand, for Melvor seemed in no hurry to notice him. He finished the wine in a leisurely manner, without looking in his direction, and when he eventually did, his tone was curt and disapproving.
What is your report?
Trewan received a letter from my hand, sir.
Gareth was torn between the necessity of showing respect and the numbing resentment brought on by this deliberate and unfair display of enmity and disregard.
And the reply?
Melvor's voice was cold. Gareth hesitated.
I was not instructed to...
You have it not. As I expected it would be. Trust a child.
I did not ask...
Silence! Speak to me when I address you, soldier. I value not your advice or opinion.
The tone was cutting. Gareth bit his lip. Melvor continued to reprove and lecture him on the merits of discipline and wit, and his lack of it. Those within hearing were rather amused, and Melvor purposely raised his voice to enhance the effects of his reprimand. When he tired of it, he dismissed the boy absently and turned his back. Gareth hurried out with the comments of the other officers ringing in his ears. Why had he been treated like this? Was it not clear that Melvor hated him? He had been unfairly branded as a dullard in front of other men that would certainly form a bad opinion of him. Mayhap the captain believed he was proud and haughty and needed the humiliation. He conjured up images of Melvor issuing unreasonable requests and instructions he knew not how to perform to satisfaction, and then upbraiding him in the hearing of his comrades. These thoughts almost ruined his appetite, especially since he had envisioned his training as a soldier so much differently. He was too hungry to let it bother him for long, though, and by the time he had finished the meal he had admitted to himself that he had neglected to report to Melvor on time, and had delivered the late report in front of the officers. The captain had had no choice but to be strict with him. He had regained his spirits almost completely by the time he washed the stickiness of the peach off his hands in a finger bowl. He allowed himself to feel a little of the excitement he had tasted when he had put on the uniform for the first time. Melvor's strictness was not meant to belittle him, he was sure, but the man, admirable though he was, would never quite escape the silent horror of the executioner that still clung to him from 3 cycles before. Gareth could still see the impassive face set in grim acceptance of the inevitable, regardless of the tears and entreaties of his own son. Again he felt the unreality of the proceedings, from the stark, pale faces of the priests and judges, among them the captain, to the initially toneless voice of the accused, the confessions and witnesses, the final passionate plea from the son to be heard, so abruptly cut short by the father. And then the unimaginable sentence. He could remember wondering what a boy of 12 cycles could do to warrant being put to death, or how a father could condemn his son. Perchance it had only been his youth at the time, but he had hated the captain then, who would condemn without hearing what had not been rehearsed, and the priests who sat in judgment, and even his own father a little, who would allow such things to be done. The next day they had destroyed him, Garrett Seth Malvor, a clever, adventurous boy, second only to Prince Lucain in everyone's esteem. Then he had seen the strain on the father's face, the pale struggle not to take the place of his son's body in the flames. He remembered the awe in which he had held the temple ever since. It was a place of fear and abhorrence, that one did not even visit in dreams, till the time appointed to enter it at the presentation. It was hard to accept that what Garrett had died for would belong to him within 5 days, and he was no older than the other had been. There were few men in the hall now. Most had retired to the tub rooms or were occupying their time elsewhere with games and jesting before their watch. Then a stranger in silver-edged black livery entered the hall and looked around before heading over to the table where he was seated. It was evident that the man wanted to speak to him, since he alone remained in that section of the hall. He rose in anticipation. As the man approached, Gareth recognized at once that he was wearing the little seen insignia of the Queen, who never appeared in public any more, who at last looked at him when he had only 5 cycles, who had spoken to him but twice in his life that he was aware of, whom men now openly deemed insane, his mother. The lackey wore a somewhat sad face to match his somber livery. He kept his voice low, as if he knew that his mere presence would draw enough attention.
Prince Gareth.
The boy found his own voice to be a little uncertain.
Yes?
The Queen requires your presence as soon as you are able to comply with her request.
He had half feared receiving the tidings of her death, and not knowing how he would react to it. The simple request was strangely difficult to comprehend.
Tonight.
He realized he must seem a fool to this man.
Certainly, Prince, if it would suit you.
Of course. It suits me. I am able to comply right away.
Follow me, then, if it pleases you.
He turned on his heels and strode out of the room without waiting to see if it pleased or not. Gareth followed close behind in a daze of conflicting thoughts. The Queen's private chambers were guarded by 2 similarly dressed attendants, but their manner differed substantially from that of the lackey. They did not move a muscle as he passed between them, but merely stared into space, the sharp points of their black kite shields resting on the carpeted floor. He was ushered into an anteroom where a clinging chill seemed to pervade all, despite the blazing fire and the fine sun-tide evening. The carved chairs and delicate tables, the rich carpets and tapestries, the gilded wall sconces, all had an enigmatic existence, far removed from the life and activity of the surrounding castle, as if they had been locked in time, a living memory. The very smell was different, as of a bygone age, its fragility carefully preserved in the cotton softness of reminiscence. The messenger halted before a darkened doorway in the opposite wall, and wordlessly motioned the boy through with a sweep of his extended arm. Gareth stepped into the shadows of an indoor garden. It was bathed only in the starlight filtering through the wide, unshuttered windows running the length of its walls. In the distance, a light crystal beckoned him towards another doorway. Again he felt the separateness of this chamber, its detachment from the forces that shaped the lives of those outside it. But its otherness was decaying, losing its potency. The whispers of the tiny fountain was receding to the murmuring of water only, forgetting the secrets it once shared. The dank, mossy ferns and greenery shrank to woody stems and leaves even as he passed through their fleeting embrace. He felt himself excluded from their mystery, purposely blinded by their appearance of ordinariness, and yet he sensed a faint tug hinting of the many hidden things they had witnessed. Perchance it was the silvery starlight that made one perceive such oddities, for its play of shadows and shapes augmented by the reflecting droplets of the fountain made a mockery of one's discernment, and suggested possibilities that had no substance in the light of day. The crystal was of greenish golden hue, rare and costly. It was glowing softly, the energies at its core only partially awakened, but it cast enough light to illuminate the ornate doorknob. This was molded in the likeness of some creature's head, a lion or dragon, with hackles raised in a savage snarl. The eyes seemed to fix on his own in warning, as though he would incur the wrath reserved for an intruder if he dared approach. Then he noticed the movement. It shifted its gaze as quickly as the eye could wink. He retracted his hand that had been ready to knock on the heavy door and studied the head closely. Would it move again? Had it moved at all? The light from the fountain or the shadow of his outstretched arm, that had created the illusion. The eyes were dull now, staring straight ahead. Mayhap it had been the shifting light from the fountain or the shadow of his outstretched arm that had created the illusion. He knocked forcefully. The muffled voice of a woman bid him enter with a single word. He hesitated only for a moment before gripping the doorknob. It was cold to the touch and heavy, shaped from foreign metal. He turned it slowly. The man was desperately angry. It was his father.
I have protected you long enough. It ends here.
3 beady drops of blackness broke through the deep red surface of the wine, sending tiny ripples to the gilt edge of the goblet. It was a beautifully crafted object, precious stones set in the golden rounding.
Long enough. It ends here.
A hand grasped it unsteadily, a woman's hand, young and yet stretched thin with care and silent anguish.
It ends here.
The door yielded to the weight of his body as if it had suddenly been unlocked, and he almost fell into the room. It was her bedchamber, lit by a single crystal, casting its light over the bed hangings, a small writing desk, and low stool. The voice spoke a single word he did not recognize, and several more crystals, mounted at intervals along the wall, illuminated the remainder of the room. This light was closer to that of candles or torches, yet it had none of the flickering instability of the latter. The queen was seated at a larger desk, strewn with forgotten scrolls and quills. On the wall a tall ship sailed amidst the angry green waves of the inland sea, a striking and artful rendition, though the tapestry showed signs of aging. Something tugged at Gareth's thoughts as his eyes ran over it, before he could discern the finely crafted amber beads at its border, and noticed that one of the leaves was missing, the frayed patch where it had been torn away left unrepaired. His gaze was forced back to the desk. At its center stood a bejeweled goblet of gold. Gareth could not tear away his eyes from it, even as the woman addressed him and demanded his attention.
You, of all people, have reason enough to ignore a call from me.
The voice was flat and tired.
You are my mother.
He took a step towards her, his eyes still straying to the glittering horror on the table. It was empty. She had noticed his fascination.
You find my cup interesting?
She picked it up carelessly and held it out to him. He cringed involuntarily. A little frown appeared between her dark-rimmed eyes as she replaced it on the table. He looked at her for the first time. She had been beautiful once, her long hair like waving wheat in the wind, her eyes the bright blue of a sun-tide sky, her smile infectious and quick. Little remained now of her sprightliness. Her skin seemed stretched too tightly over the curves of her face. Her eyes had retreated into shadows. Her hands and wrists were thin and spindly. She regarded him oddly, an unspoken question in the air. His mind searched frantically for something to say.
You command the crystals?
She smiled painfully.
Yes, I do.
She was suddenly beautiful again.
We are bringers of light, are we not? And yet I am trapped in shadows of my own making.
The smile faded.
But I thought only priests.
Her laughter was the tinkling of a little bell.
Priests? Old carrion crows. Do not believe everything they tell you. In fact, believe nothing they tell you. They live under ignorance and the fear it engenders. But I have little time.
She was suddenly nervous.
They do not know you are here, or they would have tried to prevent it.
She beckoned him closer and grasped his shoulders in a surprisingly strong grip.
You have no reason to trust me,
or to do what I ask, but I need something from you.
Her eyes pried into his as if to read his thoughts. Gareth felt her nervousness rub off on him.
What sort of thing?
An oath.
Was she perhaps truly insane?
What do I...
She released his shoulders and selected a sealed envelope from among the papers on her desk. Her voice was urgent.
Swear to me that you will only read this letter when I am no longer alive.
He saw the black drops, the impossible cup, and hesitated. She mistook his hesitation.
If you cannot swear this, I will understand, but I will have to destroy the letter.
Her tone was almost pleading now.
No, I will swear it.
Give me your hand.
She took hold of his right hand with both hers. They were cold and clammy.
Swear it.
I swear on pain of dishonor or death that I will not read this letter until after you are dead.
He shuddered at his own words.
Swear it by the stone.
I swear it by the stone.
Swear it by your father.
I swear it by Thingor, king...
Use the words I said.
I swear it by my father.
She released his hands and sat back with a sigh. He took the letter from her shaking hand.
Hide it where no one will look for it. Do not trust anyone with this. Destroy it when you have read it.
She stood up and embraced him awkwardly.
Go now.
Gareth stood for a moment, his feelings in a whirl of confusion.
Are you in trouble?
I am fading away.
But why? Why have you...
I know you must have 1,000 questions. I cannot answer some of them, and others I would not.
She bit her lip as if to prevent these answers from revealing themselves in spite of her declared resolve. A look of utter dejection and regret lingered in her gaze. She reached out her hand to tilt his head towards the light.
Gareth, at least I let you keep the name I chose.
His voice was low and pleading.
Let me help you.
The trace of a smile flickered across her face. She drew him into her arms again, this time without the discomfiture of before. Her gown smelled of dried, sun-tied flowers. She whispered into his hair.
I am beyond such aid as you could give me. Besides, I should have been the one to aid you.
She released him, but not before he felt the trembling of her body, as she struggled to keep control of her emotion.
I have kept you here too long. Go now, please.
She turned her back to prevent any further conversation. He turned to go. The handwriting was thin and spidery, somehow lacking in substance, as if its owner no longer deemed it important enough to waste effort on. He traced the curves of his own name slowly, as if it could bring him some certainty in the maze of his thoughts. He fought the urge to open the letter there and then, and reminded himself of the urgent oath he could not break. Then he shoved the unopened envelope into the space between his clothing chest and the rough stones of the bedroom wall, grabbed the nightshirt, and strode from the room. It was late, probably well into the second night watch, and the tub room was deserted. He lounged in the luxurious warm water and tried to forget the events of another strange day. Before long he found himself dozing, half asleep. The seemingly endless supply of hot water in Belruth Castle was the envy of the other garrison towns. He wondered what they used as fuel to heat so much water, for there was an abundant supply at any hour of day or night. Perhaps they made use of the terrible heat he had felt in the foundry. Could the conduits run all the way from the foundry? It seemed impractical. She was going to take her life, because the king would or could not protect her any longer. Protect her from what? And why had she ignored him all his life to give him a letter now it was too late? She was going to kill herself. Helpless anger rose up in him. Could she not try to escape them? He could help her slip out through the sheep gate, and they would disappear into the hills, and they would flee far from Belruth and the king. Fengor did not love her. He wanted to be rid of her. He would be happy when she was dead, his mother. And she would not even tell him why. Could it have something to do with him? No, she would not have called him to her side then. If she did not care for him, she would not have called. It was his father's doing, and Talon, that hateful old man. He sighed heavily and rinsed the last soapy water out of his hair. Every day brought more questions, and he's always had far more questions than answers. Who would supply them? Somewhere there had to be a man who could tell him everything he wanted to know, and when he was a little older and would not be ordered about so much, he would go and find him.